So we're looking at blood and blood flow in this last lecture here, and the big thing we're looking at is this concept of cardiac output. And we're looking at the volume of blood that's moving out of the heart per minute. So this is usually expressed in milliliters per minute. This is a product of both heart rate and stroke volume. So how fast the heart's contracting, so how many beats per minute, and with each contraction, how much blood is being ejected out of the ventricles into the system. So the heart rate, as we talked about earlier, is affected by the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So based on the environment that you're in, or the things you're thinking about, or the things you're doing, the stimulants you've taken, your body's either in a flight or fight stance. So it's going to be ramped up, or it's going to be in a rest and recover, or it's going to be toned down. And then stroke volume is affected by your hydration levels, how much water you have, your blood volume. It's also going to look at your vascular tone. So are your blood vessels constricted, or are they dilated? And that's also a product of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Your heart rate at rest is about 5 liters per minute. The point of the cardiac output of that 5 liters per minute is to supply the working tissues. And at rest, it's supplying the tissues just to maintain their survivability, so no added benefit or added extra work that's being done. What can happen sometimes is cardiac output's influenced by both heart rate and stroke volume. So you can have situations where stroke volume goes up, and to maintain that same 5 liters per minute of output at rest, your heart rate doesn't need to be as high. So just like you would expect, if your muscles got stronger, lifting a 5-pound weight or a 50-pound weight over time, that 50-pound weight will feel like that 5-pound weight. Same thing with the heart. If that vascular tone, as you work out and you're more fit and your nervous system is able to respond more, you can have a higher stroke volume because your heart muscle is stronger. At rest, what can happen is your heart rate can drop, because your stroke volume is so high, because the heart's contracting so hard that it's ejecting so much blood into the system, that your heart rate doesn't need to beat as fast to get the same amount of oxygen to the brain, to the feet, and so forth. So what ends up happening a lot with it, in particular with endurance athletes, is you can see their resting heart rates well below 60 beats per minute. So they're at like 45, 50, 55 beats per minute. And their stroke volume is so high that they don't need that heart rate to be so elevated. So sometimes you get this misinterpretation that heart rate's an indicator of performance, when it's really not. Just because someone's heart rate is lower, that might mean that their stroke volume's higher. It doesn't mean they can beat you in a race and so forth. Heart rate is tied to intensity or activity. So when you increase activity or increase effort or increase intensity, your heart rate's going to increase at the same time. And so you kind of seen this quasi-linear relationship between exercise intensity and heart rate. So as you start to make your muscles work more, your muscular system has to work harder, and it needs more oxygen, so your heart has to match that. So your heart is a servant to the working muscles through this exercise intensity. And as you would expect, as you increase your exercise intensity, so as you work harder, your heart rate's going to have to go up to supply that. And you do get to the point where your heart's going to go from aerobic to anaerobic state, and it needs to maintain. And so your heart rate won't go any higher. And so that means your muscles can't work any harder. So you hit a wall, if you will. This is where this relationship happens between intensity and outcomes. The faster you go or the harder you go, the more your heart's going to elevate. And again, it becomes an indicator or a window to how much stress your body is being exposed to. And this is where you get these effort and effect, these outcomes from these very specific intensities that you were applying to that. And we get more into this in 231. But again, as your exercise goes up from rest, 60 to 80 beats per minute, you can get up to this 180 to almost 200 beats per minute. So at rest, as I said earlier, cardiac output's about 5 liters per minute, and your liver and your kidneys and your digestive system receives majority of that. Your muscles receive quite a bit just at rest with you not doing anything at all. And 5 liters is about 2 2-liter bottles of soda or pop and 1-liter bottle of water. You might like Coca-Cola. I prefer Dr. Pepper. Regardless of what you drink, whatever poison you drink there, the Dr. Pepper or the Coke, whatever, 5 liters, during heavy exercise, your blood cardiac output increases by 500%. So you'll go from 5 liters a minute to about 25 liters per minute. Blood volumes in men are about 5 to 6 liters. Obviously, the bigger you are, the more blood you'll have. And women, about 4 to 5 liters. So roughly the same, but you have about a liter more in men. And obviously, the bigger you are, the more you're going to have. I love this slide. And the reason I like this so much is that it kind of looks at your 5 liters of blood that you have, plus or minus. It shows you not only here at the bottom at rest, where about a quarter of it is going to the digestion system, another 20% going to elimination, so almost 50% of that going to the parasympathetic responsibilities of rest and digest or repair. And you can see that the brain gets 15%, the heart gets 4 or 5%, and the muscles get about 20% of that 5 liters. During heavier exercise, higher intensity activities, you can see that the priority to the digestion and elimination drops immensely. The heart gets about the same because its primary role in responding. Nervous system drops a little bit, and the muscular system is the resource hog here. About 70 to 80% of that cardiac output is going to the working muscles. So it's not an understatement to say that the heart is a servant to the musculature. Look how much it's getting versus how much that's getting of that blood flow. So that's how much of a demand of that blood vessel, of that blood flow, of that oxygen is going to that tissue. This makes more sense when we talk about metabolism and metabolic output and calorie burning, to show that muscle tissue is very important in the metabolic process. Now recall that when you go from 5 liters to 25 liters per minute, the amount of blood in your body never changes, right? So when you go from 5 liters, that's all the blood you have, 5 liters of blood. And you, whether you are at rest or sprinting for your life, same amount of blood. So your body has to have enough blood at high intensity activities. And you can see that this is the percentage where blood is kept in the body. And you can see that over 2/3 of it, or almost 2/3 of it, is stored within the veins. So blood, about 7% here. You can see the percentages here, but most of it is kind of slow in these veins. And the way it works is, if you've ever been to an amusement park like Great America or Disney, when you're in line for the roller coaster on really busy days, they have all those lines opened up so they can kind of have these overflow and kind of keep people contained. And then days that it's not very busy, they can open those lanes up, and you can kind of cut through those lines and get to the entrance of the ride a lot faster. So that's kind of how the veins work. Instead of having like cutoff points, because remember that's a closed system, so there's no like bypasses. The way this works is whether through vascular dilation or constriction. So when the body needs a lot of blood, you're going to get constricted blood vessels so that it can get through the path quicker. And then when it doesn't need so much, it will open up and make them more relaxed, like a lazy river. So it will go from like rapids to lazy river based on the size or diameter of those blood vessels. During exercise, this can cause a problem because gravity is always pulling blood down, and in times of high energy demand, you get those changes in blood pressure, particularly like in the dilated blood vessels where blood flow is you're trying to open up the lane so blood can go faster, you can get more through it. So think of like 1 lane of traffic, and now your body opens up like 4 lanes of traffic so it can push more blood through. During activity, that's fine because you have blood that's circulating through, you're moving. And what you'll see often is, particularly at these endurance events, you'll see at the end of the race, people passing out or collapsing because they were under so much stress for an hour or 2 hours. So all their blood vessels dilated, so they got bigger to allow more blood flow to come through. They stop activity, and all of a sudden they pass out. And what's happened is their blood vessels gotten so big that the blood is no longer able to get up to the heart. The heart's not pumping hard enough or fast enough, and blood is pooling down in their legs. And when the body ever senses not enough blood flow to the head, to the brain, it tries to get you horizontal as quickly as possible, aka fainting. So you become horizontal, so you're no longer under the effects of gravity. And what you'll see often is people with their legs raised up so that blood flow can, if they pass out, you're supposed to raise their legs up so they can get blood into the torso so it can get back up to the brain, and they come to. So what usually happens is they tell you to do a cool down and not stop abruptly. Now the system in place here is that, if you remember earlier we looked at arteries and veins, the big thing about veins is they had valves, because veins are very stretchy. So there's no way that pressure from the heart here is pushing blood down here, and then that same pressure is able to push the blood back up. That it just doesn't happen. You can get a little pressure here, but that's not how blood vessels work or return the blood flow to the heart. What happens is you've got these one-way valves that act like an elevator, and every time you take a step or contract, muscles are squeezing this blood, and the blood can't go back this way, it can only go up. And so every time you step, you're contracting, relaxing, pushing blood from the lower levels up to the body, and that solves, through the one-way pump and the muscle pumping action, this gravity problem, because the blood now can get from the lower extremities up back to the heart and go through circulation. So the moral of the story is do your cool downs. When we look at the blood is not just blood cells, but it's made up of plasma. It's made up of white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets. And if you were to take a blood sample and centrifuge it, you would separate out that only about less than half of your blood is actually red blood cells. The majority of it is plasma, and that's made up mostly of water and some proteins here and there. But you have platelets that are involved in clotting. You have your white blood cells that are involved in immune function and some other aspects. And you have your red blood cells, which are purely a carrier of oxygen. And if you were to take a more in-depth class, you would find that there are multiple types of white blood cells. But again, outside the scope, but just to appreciate that there are blood vessels there. And just keep in mind that red blood cells, that is the workhorse of the circulatory system, and that's the transport mechanism, which gets oxygen to the tissues, picks up carbon dioxide, and brings that back. So hopefully that was helpful, and we'll look forward now to the respiratory system to see how the gas exchange and the blood aspect actually happens.